There are days when the word Easter does not immediately brighten the heart. It is meant to be good news, yet the soul still feels as though it is walking away from something that has ended. This passage does not force that weary heart to turn around too quickly. It quietly shows how the risen Lord comes near, even to those who are still walking in confusion. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus walked like people whose sorrow had not yet lifted. After the death of Jesus, their hopes had collapsed, and the reports they heard could not yet gather into faith within them. Some spoke of the empty tomb, and some spoke of angels. But a heart crushed by loss does not easily receive good news. Their feet were moving forward, but their hearts were still circling the place where everything seemed to fall apart. We pass through hours like that as well. We hear the word, yet it does not feel clear. We hear comfort, yet the heart does not quickly rise. Even the thought that the Lord is near can seem far away. Prayer loses its way on our lips, and the heart slows down before what it cannot understand. As the night grows deeper, what has been broken can feel more real than what has been promised, and disappointment can hold the heart more tightly than hope. Yet it is on that very road that the Lord comes near first, opens the heart through the Scriptures, and at last opens the eyes so that life begins again. In this Easter meditation, we will slowly follow how the risen Lord walks with those in despair, and how a fading heart begins to burn again in His presence. As a fading heart begins to burn again, it does not usually begin with clear recognition. More often, it begins when the soul is still dim, still unsure what to hold on to, and still turning over the scene of loss again and again. That is how it was for the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. They were going somewhere, yet they seemed less like people moving toward a future and more like people trying to walk away from a shattered hope. The hope they had carried with Jesus appeared to have broken beneath the weight of the cross, and the reports they had heard only deepened their confusion rather than lifting their hearts. Before the news of the resurrection could reach them as joy, it passed by them as something they could not yet understand. So that road was not merely a road to another village. It was also the road of a heart carrying what it could not make sense of. Then the passage shows something quiet and decisive. Jesus Himself drew near and went with them. The two disciples did not find Him first. They did not meet Him after their faith had fully recovered. Their companionship with Him did not begin after their eyes had already been opened. He came near while they still did not recognize Him, while their sorrow was still present, and while their hearts were still unsettled. This shows that the first declaration of the resurrection is not only that Jesus conquered death, it is also that the risen Lord does not remain far from discouraged people. He walks directly into their road. There are seasons in our lives that feel much the same. Faith has not entirely disappeared, yet we can no longer see clearly what we are holding on to. We read the Word, but the heart does not quickly grow bright. We try to pray, but our thoughts circle without rest. We confess that God is living, yet the weight of our circumstances seems unable to meet that confession. Outwardly, we continue through the day, yet inwardly one unfinished question keeps making the soul heavy. Why did this happen? Why did the answer we hoped for not come? Why did the Lord not intervene sooner? When we do not understand, the heart lingers in the same place for a long time. In such hours, we often conclude that the Lord must be far away. It can seem as though He is doing nothing, as though silence is all that remains, and as though we are walking this road alone. But the road to Emmaus tells a different truth. The fact that they could not see Him did not mean there was no companionship. The fact that they did not recognize Him did not mean He had not come. In fact, He was nearest when they saw the least, and He was walking beside them when their sorrow was deepest. This is the first comfort Easter gives to those who walk through despair. The resurrection is not only a victory announced from afar, it is the present nearness of the Lord, who comes to the side of a broken heart and walks with it. So what we hold on to today is not how quickly our hearts recover, but the truth that even before we recognize Him, he has already drawn near. The road may feel long, the day may be fading, and the heart may still feel dim. Yet the Lord knows the pace of discouraged people and walks with them in it. Yet his companionship does not stop at simply standing beside them in comfort. It goes further, to the place where he fully knows the background of their broken hearts. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus were not merely overcome by sadness. They were walking with their own reasons, their own interpretation, and their own unresolved thoughts. In the way they spoke about Jesus, hope and disappointment were tightly woven together. They had hoped that he was the one who would redeem Israel. This was not a small expectation. It was the long-awaited hope that God would finally bring salvation into a weary and burdened reality. And they had placed Jesus at the center of that hope. But the cross seemed to shatter that expectation in a moment, because what had actually happened looked so different from the picture they had carried in their hearts. What deepened their confusion even more was that the news of the resurrection did not immediately settle into their hearts. The women had gone to the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They reported that angels had spoken to them. Others went and found the tomb empty. Yet all of these reports did not become living certainty within the two disciples. It was not simply because the facts were insufficient. It was because their hearts had already been dwelling too long in the language of loss. After passing through deep sorrow, a person often finds it easier to believe what is collapsed than what is newly promised. Words of hope may still be heard, yet the soul cannot easily step into them. What has been lost feels too visible, and the strength to receive unseen grace seems too weak. This was the place from which the two disciples were walking. They were not only speaking inaccurately, they were seeing everything through wounded expectation. So Jesus does not reveal himself at once. He first listens to them. He asks what they are discussing as they walk, and he allows the story gathered inside them to come out into the open. This is not a mere request for information. The Lord already knows all that has happened, yet he lets a discouraged heart speak its sorrow aloud. Before faith is restored, he allows confusion to be named. We often think it would be best if the Lord answered quickly, explained everything quickly, and opened our eyes at once. But he often works more deeply than that. He first brings to light what has actually broken within us, which hope has been wounded, and which interpretation has been quietly holding our hearts captive. The light of the resurrection does not only announce the outcome of an event, it also shines upon the reason our eyes have grown dim. We are often much the same. Discouragement does not usually come as a passing feeling alone. It often comes when the picture we trusted falls apart. We thought the Lord would work in one way, yet he did not. We hoped prayer would open a certain path, yet the road turned elsewhere. We believed that if God were with us, at least this much would be kept safe. Yet life unfolded in a completely different scene. When that happens, the heart is shaken at a deep level. And when that shaking lasts, interpretation becomes stronger than the word, and resignation begins to feel more familiar than promise. In such moments, what we need is not only for the visible problem to be fixed. We need our inner background to be brought before the Lord, so that we may see from what place our hearts have been looking at reality. On the road to Emmaus, the Lord did not ignore that background. He listened to their disappointment, and he entered the very place where their expectations had fallen apart. So the grace of the resurrection is not a light that ignores wounds. It is a light that enters the wound itself and begins to illuminate its meaning again. Yet his words do not remain only at the level of soothing pain. They go deeper, into the place where they reveal why the heart has stayed in darkness so long. As the two disciples walked to Emmaus with Jesus beside them, they still did not understand what they were missing. They were not people who knew nothing. They had heard reports. They knew what had happened around Jesus. But hearing facts is not the same as understanding them. And hearing events is not the same as receiving them within the purposes of God. Their sorrow came not only from losing Jesus, but also from having confined the work of God within the frame of their own expectation. The cross looked like failure. Their waiting felt finished, and the news of the resurrection had not yet entered deeply enough to break apart that frame. At that point, Jesus exposes the slowness of their hearts. He says they are slow to believe all that the prophets had spoken. And he asks whether the Christ did not have to suffer these things and then enter his glory. This moment matters deeply. The Lord does not deny their sorrow, yet he does not leave their interpretation untouched. A discouraged heart often judges the whole story by the scene it can currently see. It takes present loss, present silence, and present delay as the final measure of how God is working. So suffering begins to look like absence. A delayed answer begins to feel like neglect. A path we cannot understand begins to read as failure. But the Lord corrects our sight at that very point. He reminds us that one visible scene is not the whole story, and that the saving work of God is sometimes completed through the very place we would have called defeat. This is not only their story. We often trust in God, while still assuming that the way He works will remain close to our own expectations. We imagine that the salvation we are waiting for will remove pain quickly, and that if God is with us, the road should open in a clearer and smoother way. So when we meet a scene like the cross, the heart begins to shake. We ask why the pain lasts this long, why this season does not pass, and why reality seems unchanged even after prayer. Those questions themselves are not wrong. But when those questions begin to judge the will of God only by our own standard, the heart stops resting before the Word and becomes more deeply trapped inside its own interpretation. The resurrection breaks that captivity. God prepared a salvation deeper, greater, and farther reaching than the one we would have planned. And that salvation moved through the cross into glory. So the heart of this scene is not simply that the two disciples were ignorant. What matters more is that the risen Lord does not leave them there. He opens the way again through the Word. Before their eyes were opened, their interpretation had to be opened. Before their emotions were restored, the Scriptures had to make a path through their confusion. The same is often true for us. A heart begins to live again, not only when circumstances change, but when the Lord leads us through our sorrow and teaches us to see the purposes of God again. It is not the shame of being wrong that turns us back. It is the grace of being shown a larger meaning we had failed to see. So the light of Easter is not only a comfort that brightens our mood, it is a light that teaches hearts that once read the cross as failure to read it again as the path of God's saving work. That purpose does not come as a vague comfort. It comes as light slowly opened through the whole of the written word. Jesus began with Moses and all the prophets, and he interpreted to them the things concerning himself in all the Scriptures. This shows that the grace of the resurrection does not arrive only by suddenly overwhelming a person with one astonishing event. Rather than first overturning the hearts of the two disciples through shock, the Lord leads them back into the long witness of God's Word. He does not treat their confusion as a strange exception. He places it again within the larger history of God's saving work. In doing so, their broken hearts are not merely comforted emotionally, they are being prepared to stand again upon truth. When pain grows deep, we easily feel that the scene before us is the whole story. Today's sorrow covers all time. Present silence seems to speak for the whole will of God. One reality we cannot explain begins to shake the structure of faith itself. So when the heart collapses, we often become trapped by the one scene that does not make sense, rather than remaining within the wider flow of the Word. But Jesus does not leave the two disciples there. He teaches them to see the present moment again through the whole pattern of Scripture. He shows them how promise had been unfolding all along, how suffering and glory were not two separate roads, but part of one purpose in God, and how the words concerning the Messiah had already pointed to this very path. This was not merely the addition of more information. Scattered pieces were beginning to gather into one whole. Events that seemed disconnected in the dark we're beginning to join again within the Word. We need this same restoration. When the heart is weary, we often long for one short sentence of comfort, one sign of immediate relief, one outcome that lets us breathe again at once. The Lord knows that weakness. Yet the way He restores us is often deeper than that. More than soothing us for a moment, He brings us back under the steady flow of His Word. No matter how overwhelming or tangled our present reality may feel, God has already revealed His way in the Scriptures, and that Word remains longer than our emotions and holds us more truly than our shifting impressions. That is why the reopening of the Word matters so deeply when a discouraged heart begins to live again. Scripture is not only a book of information. It is light that shows us where we are standing, how God is at work, and which promises remain alive even when we cannot yet see their fulfillment. On the road to Emmaus, the eyes of the two disciples were not yet opened, but something had already begun within them. Outwardly, they were still walking the same road, and they still did not recognize Jesus. Yet while He opened the Scriptures, the hardened interpretation inside them was slowly loosening. This is a profound grace. We often assume that God is working only when something visible changes, but sometimes the Lord turns the soil of the heart through the Word before the eyes are opened. He softens judgments that had become rigid. He lets the inner life breathe again where resignation had shut it closed. He prepares the heart to receive a greater purpose beyond its shattered expectations. So the power of Easter is not found only in the final moment of recognition. It is also found in the patience of the Lord, who reshapes a discouraged heart through the Scriptures until that recognition comes. Yet that truth does not remain only as something arranged in the mind. It enters more deeply, until it begins to kindle the heart again. Later, the two disciples say to one another, "Did not our heart burn within us while He talked with us on the road, and while He opened to us the Scriptures?" That confession matters deeply. It means that even before their eyes were opened, their hearts were already responding. Everything had not yet become fully clear. They still did not recognize Him plainly enough to name Him. Yet through the Word, something that had grown quiet and almost lifeless within them was beginning to live again. The words of the risen Lord were not merely an explanation to organize confusion. They were the fire of life warming the center that had nearly gone cold. We often think of restoration only as a visible moment. We assume that God has worked when tears stop, when problems are resolved, or when a clear answer finally appears. But the road to Emmaus shows that restoration can begin sooner than that. Their circumstances had not changed. Their eyes had not yet been fully opened. They still did not know who was speaking with them. Yet while they listened to the Word, warmth was already returning to their hearts. Discouragement makes the heart cold. It causes us to withdraw expectation, to stop hoping, and to let even the Word of God pass by like a familiar sentence with no living power. That is why one of the most dangerous conditions is not sorrow itself, but a heart that no longer responds. Yet the Lord addresses that very place through His Word. He places quiet warmth into the inner life that resignation had chilled, and He makes the heart that seemed closed and lifeless begin to tremble again before the purposes of God. This burning is not the same as emotional excitement. It is not a brief surge of feeling that rises and disappears. It is the deep response that comes when truth enters the heart. It does not come because every answer has been received. It comes because the Word of the Lord begins to carry greater weight within us than the darkness around us. That is why this burning can be strong without being loud, clear without being fully explainable, and powerful enough to lift a person even before any outward conclusion has appeared. There are days when nothing before our eyes has changed, and yet one verse remains in the heart and quietly holds us. Prayer may still feel weak. Circumstances may still feel heavy. Resolution may still seem far away. Yet somehow the heart does not completely go out. In that hidden place, the Lord is already at work, unseen yet unmistakably. He is causing the warmth of life to move through us again by His Word. Easter is not only the day we remember an empty tomb, it is also the day we learn that a heart grown cold can burn again. The Lord does not first meet those walking through despair with a demand to be strong. He does not rush them to understand everything at once. Instead, He opens the Scriptures and gently awakens the part of them that had been closed for so long. So restoration includes not only the final moment when the eyes are opened, it also includes the quiet hour in which the heart first begins to live again while listening to the Word. We need that grace today as well. Even if nothing outward has yet changed, we need the grace by which the heart responds again before the Word, by which a dulled soul leans once more toward the Lord, and by which holy warmth enters what had grown cold within us. As that awakened heart continues on, it arrives at one central principle. To recognize the risen Lord is not the result of a person forcing back darkness by sheer effort. It is a grace that opens within the way and the moment appointed by the Lord Himself. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus had listened to His words for a long time, and their hearts had grown warm within that unfolding of Scripture. Yet even that burning did not immediately lead them to recognize Him. They came near the village, and still they did not clearly see who this companion was. Only when they urged Him to stay with them, sat down at the table, and Jesus took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them, were their eyes finally open. That order matters. Restoration did not arrive in one sudden burst. A heart prepared by the Word was opened at last, in the Lord's chosen way, and in the Lord's chosen time. A deep principle of the resurrection is found here. The Lord is the one who reveals Himself, and He is also the one who opens our eyes. In other words, the power to recognize Him does not rest in the emotions or insight of a discouraged person, but in the living Lord Himself. We often think that if we concentrate more, understand more, or sort our thoughts more clearly, then we will be able to grasp God more fully. There is value in attending carefully to the Word. Yet the road to Emmaus shows that even recognition itself is a gift given by the Lord. Their eyes had been restrained, and their eyes were opened, all under His sovereign hand. So restoration is not an achievement. It is an act of grace. It is not the result of our breaking a path through confusion by ourselves, but the gift of clarity that comes when the Lord draws near, speaks, remains, and breaks bread before us. The moment of the broken bread also shows how personal and intimate this recognition truly is. The two disciples were not simply gathering more information until they could finally solve the answer. They asked Him to remain. They sat at the same table. Their eyes were opened in the moment when the Lord broke bread with His own hands. This shows that the risen Christ is not only someone to be understood from a distance. He becomes more clearly known as He is welcomed near. The Word prepares the heart. Remaining deepens the relationship. And the breaking of the bread reveals His presence in a decisive way. So recognizing the Lord does not end with hearing more explanation. When a heart warmed by the Word invites Him to remain and sits with Him, grace moves toward clearer sight. The same principle continues in our lives. At times, the heart begins to move while listening to the Word, and yet everything is not fully clear. We may sense that the Lord is at work, but still wonder why our eyes are not yet completely opened. The road to Emmaus shows that even this delay is not wasted. The Lord first revives the cold heart, and then opens the eyes at the fitting moment. In that process, He teaches us something vital. To recognize Him is not a certainty we squeeze out of ourselves. It is grace we receive when He gives Himself to us. That is why we must learn to remain rather than hurry. We must stay before the Word rather than rush toward conclusions. And we must open the inner door so that the Lord may stay with us. Easter is not only the season that reveals Christ's victory over death, it also reveals the way He opens closed eyes by grace. And that grace still makes us see again today, through the Word, through abiding, and through the nearness of His presence. What follows after opened eyes is not merely private comfort within the soul. The two disciples begin to move in an entirely new direction the moment they recognize Him. Their eyes were opened in the breaking of the bread. They knew Him, and then He vanished from their sight. On the surface, it seems like the very moment they would most want to hold on to passed too quickly. They had only just recognized Him, and now He was no longer visible. The explanation had ended. The meal had ended. The moment itself had passed. Yet their faith did not collapse again. That is because the decisive thing was no longer whether His physical form remained before their eyes, but that their eyes had already been opened and their hearts had already come alive again. The risen Lord did not merely appear for a moment and disappear. He changed the direction of their inner lives. So the two disciples immediately confirm what had happened within them. They say to one another that their hearts burned within them while He spoke to them on the road and opened the Scriptures to them. Then, at once, they rise and return to Jerusalem. This is a profound turning point. Only a short while earlier, they had been walking away from Jerusalem. They had been moving away with loss and confusion in their hearts. But now they turn back. It is the same night, the same bodies, the same world around them. And yet the direction of their steps has completely changed. This is what resurrection does in lived reality. It is not merely a comfort that warms emotion. It is a power that turns back the steps that were moving away. Discouragement makes people withdraw. It draws them away from community, away from the place where they once followed the Lord, and quietly, farther from the life of faith. But a person who has truly recognized the Lord cannot continue in the same direction as before. When the heart lives again, the direction of the walk changes as well. This matters in our lives too. Restoration does not remain only as something inward and private. When the Lord becomes real to us again, we begin to remember the places to which we must return. We think again of the obedience we had postponed, the place of prayer from which we had drifted, the place of Scripture we had neglected in weariness, the community and relationships from which we stepped back because of hurt, and the calling we had quietly given up on, even while still speaking words of faith. Before, even thinking about such places felt heavy. But when the truth that the Lord is living becomes real within the heart, something in us begins to want to walk back. Nothing may yet be fully resolved. The future may still be unclear. Yet we no longer wish to keep going in the direction of quiet retreat. This is not the display of human resolve. It is the sign that a person who has encountered the risen Lord has received a new direction within. The fact that they returned to Jerusalem at night also shows that resurrection joy is not a force that only moves when conditions feel easy. The day was already far gone, and the road back was not the convenient choice. By ordinary wisdom, waiting until morning would have seemed safer and more reasonable. But a heart that has come alive no longer follows comfort and calculation alone. The reality that the Lord had met them, that He was alive, and that their eyes had been opened through the Word, and the breaking of the bread moved them to rise at once. Resurrection does not leave a person resting in settled resignation. It presses through old surrender and teaches the soul to rise again. So our faith can also be examined here. Are we still drifting farther toward our own Emmaus? Or has the reality of the living Lord begun to turn us back? Easter is not only the day of brief comfort after tears. It is the day when those who were walking away begin to turn again toward the place of the Lord and toward the life of His people. A changed direction of life does not stop with outward movement alone. In the end, it reshapes the very way the heart exists. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus were not merely people who gained one more piece of information. They were people who had come alive again. When they returned to Jerusalem, they found the 11 and those gathered with them, saying that the Lord had truly risen and had appeared to Simon. Then they themselves told what had happened on the road, and how He was known to them in the breaking of the bread. This shows that the grace of the resurrection does not remain sealed inside a private experience. It flows back into the shared confession of the people of God. Two discouraged people who had once been walking alone are now brought into a place where the living Lord is confessed together. For the heart to live again is not only to feel somewhat better within, it is to be restored as someone who can once again speak of the Lord's living presence with others. Here we see one of the deepest fruits of interchange. On the road to Emmaus, the two disciples had shared their sorrow with one another, but their conversation had not been leading them into light. It had been confirming the weight of broken expectation. Now, however, their lips begin to speak of the same events under an entirely different light. The loss of the cross, the confusion of the empty tomb, the burning heart under the opening of the scriptures, the opened eyes at the breaking of the bread, and the turned back steps toward Jerusalem all begin to gather into one living testimony. These are the same pieces of life, yet the meaning of those pieces has changed completely after recognizing the Lord. This is what inner renewal looks like. It is not that the wound has been erased. It is that the presence of the Lord has passed through the wound, and because of that, the scattered scenes of life begin to join together again. Resurrection is not only an event that promises a future. It is also light that teaches us to read even our past again. We need this change deeply as well. There are times when we say we believe in the Lord, and yet we still tell the story of our lives in the same tone the world would use. The things we lost, the things that collapsed, the things delayed, and the things we still cannot understand can remain so central that our lives begin to sound less like a story of the Lord's companionship and more like a record of defeat. We cannot treat wounds lightly, but a heart that has truly met the risen Lord can no longer speak only in the language of despair. That is because the Lord walked the same road with us, opened the Word in the middle of the same tears, and made himself known in the middle of ordinary human weakness. Because of that, the story of life begins to change. Inner renewal is not pretending to be bright. It is the quiet change that happens when the traces of the Lord become too real to ignore. The pain may still remain, but it can no longer claim to be the whole story. This scene also shows that a heart made alive becomes a heart ready to bear witness. On the way to Emmaus, the two disciples had been enclosed within a conversation that never moved beyond their own sorrow. Now they return to Jerusalem and speak with others about the living Lord. This is one of the final fruits of restoration. A revived heart eventually begins to speak of Christ, not because it is forcing religious language upon itself, but because the Lord's hand on its road has become too real to keep hidden. That is why Easter is not merely a season of private comfort. It is the season in which restored people gather and confess together that the Lord is truly alive. We need that grace today as well. We need the grace by which a heart that once repeated only its discouragement becomes a heart that can now speak of how the Lord came near on its road. And in that grace, our lives no longer remain as stories that simply ended in sorrow. They begin to be written again as stories through which the living Lord has passed. In the end, that renewed heart comes to a quiet yet certain resting place. The story of Emmaus does not remain only as the record of one moving encounter. It remains as a full testimony of how the risen Lord comes near to those who walk through despair, and how far his companionship can transform a life. At first, the two disciples walked with shattered hopes. Even with the Lord beside them, they did not recognize him, and even the reports they heard could not yet become living hope within them. But the Lord came first onto that road. He listened to their words. He opened the scriptures. He opened their eyes in the breaking of the bread. And at last, he turned those who were walking away back toward the place they had left. That turning was not only a change in direction, it was the restoration of an entire life back toward the Lord. This is where the depth of Easter is found. The resurrection is not a celebration reserved for those who have never known sorrow. It is the event in which the Lord himself comes near to those who are still walking through sorrow. That is why the road to Emmaus is not only the story of two disciples long ago. It is also our road today. Not everything may yet be explained. The heart may still feel slow. The eyes may still feel dim. Prayer may still feel short. Reality may still feel heavy. But what matters is that none of those conditions can keep the Lord from drawing near. In fact, He enters precisely that kind of road. He does not despise our slow understanding, our wounded hopes, or our cold hearts. He begins to restore us from that very place. This story teaches us that the joy of resurrection is not reserved for the strong, those who feel they cannot go much farther, those whose tears have not yet dried, and those who keep walking quietly with broken expectations may be the very ones who most deeply learn the nearness of the risen Lord. So at the end of this meditation, what we must hold on to is not how quickly our hearts have become bright. It is not whether we seem to be showing strong faith. It is the truth that the Lord still comes near to those walking through despair, that the Word can still be opened again, that closed eyes can still be opened by grace, and that a heart made alive will in time return toward the place where the Lord is. Resurrection is not only a doctrine to admire from a distance. It is the way restoration can truly begin within our steps today. So even if your heart still feels as though it is somewhere on the road to Emmaus, that is not the end. It is all right if you do not yet understand everything. It is all right if light has not yet fully returned. What matters is that this road is not abandoned. The Lord is already walking upon it with you. He is speaking. He is remaining. He is reviving the heart again. Easter is the day when a story we thought had ended begins again. More truly, it is the day we realize that even in the place we thought was finished, the Lord had already been there. So this season is not only for loud rejoicing, it is also for quiet resurrection. It teaches us that discouragement is not the final word, confusion is not the final interpretation, and loss is not the final conclusion. The Lord comes near to those who walk through despair. He warms the heart through the Word. He opens the eyes by grace. He turns retreating steps back toward the place of fellowship, calling, and life. So our road will not end in the same way either. As long as the risen Lord walks with us, a cold heart can burn again, closed eyes can open again, and steps that were moving away can turn back toward Him. So in this Easter season, rather than trying to prove something quickly, we may simply follow the quiet steps of the Lord who has come near. In that companionship, a broken heart begins to live again, and a road that once looked finished becomes again a road of hope.